8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotion. Rule 7. Admitting that you love him. Not so simple, yet he burns in this place called my heart. 3 years later. Alone on Christmas Eve, just what Hermione wanted. Well, not wanted, but the closest thing to it. She'd exchanged gifts with Ginny and Harry earlier that evening, then promptly kicked them out, slipped into something more comfortable and ordered a pizza. When the door knocked approximately 5 minutes after she'd placed her order, she stared at her door in confusion before answering and coming face to face with someone she'd done her best to forget but never could. "No," she breathed. Draco looked gaunt. Worse for wear, even more so than he looked during the war. And this was not his physical appearance Hermione was talking about. His shoulders sagged, his skin ashen, and he looked thinner than before. But his eyes, they were molten silver as he stared back at her. His voice was rough as he spoke, but he seemed to stand straighter. "Can I come in?" She found herself moving aside because she didn't know what else to do. He nodded but continued to stare at her, flickering expression crossing his face as he stared at her before stepping inside. She closed the door, leaning against it as Draco moved into the room. He did not turn for several long moments. His shoulders came up and down before he finally faced her. "I." Another knock, the one Hermione had been expecting, halted his speech. Hermione took a breath before going to the door and taking the pizza from the rather mean-looking delivery woman, who was none too impressed by the fact that Hermione didn't have her money ready and waiting. She tipped an extra $5 just to ensure she wasn't a potential murder victim later that night should they decide to return. Closing the door and setting the pizza down in the small side kitchen, Hermione turned back to Draco, who hadn't moved an inch from where he stood. "Granger, I." Hermione found herself suddenly with too much air and an intense need to speak, so she interrupted him. "Oh, hello," she said in her best scathing tone. He winced. "Sorry it's been so long since I've last seen or heard from you." She crossed her arms under her chest. "Is that what you wanted to say?" Draco stared at her for several seconds before settling on, "Something like that." "Well, it's been a lovely reunion. Is that all?" After passing the wand ban on vampires, Hermione decided to quit her job as the Ministry, starting her own business. Welfare for all magical creatures and other beings in Diagon Alley, using her savings where she could directly represent their legal rights without the dogma of politics always surrounding her constantly. She took a few of the recent graduates with her when she left, offering them a chance to do more than work as a small cog in a slow-changing machine, instead using their own agency to make real change. It was difficult to sell, considering the only promise she had was the promise itself, and that financial security was not a guarantee, at least not at first. Hermione admitted to them and to herself when she came up with the idea that it would be a big risk. All that said, she was pleasantly surprised to have over 10 signed contracts out to her only a few days after she'd made her offer. This was good, she had thought. She was grateful for the happiness permeating through the dregs of misery. She'd been despondent for months. A lovesick fool, Muggle novels would call it. How accurate the term was. Like someone could vomit all that they felt for another person and still feel a churning in their gut for more. She was happy to find something to distract herself with, to begin a new stage in her life where she could make a true difference. She didn't need anything or anyone else. She was Hermione Granger, the constant worker who helped others. She came into the wizarding world with magic at her fingertips and constant righteousness to do good, to be good, even if it meant doing things no one else was willing to do. To help those she loved, even if they didn't ask her to. Because who else would? She did. She could. She was fine with it this way. She was used to doing it alone. Alone. He clenched his jaw. "I know I left," he cursed. I know." Hermione bit into her lips so hard that it started bleeding. She whimpered and Draco noticed the sound. He walked towards her, plucking a tissue from a side table, and took her chin in his hand. He tried moving away, but he kept a firm hold.
"Stop," he commanded. "You're bleeding."
She'd said the words before she could think of them. "You broke my heart. Tissues won't fix it." She cursed how fast her brain thought of words, but that couldn't stop her from speaking her mind. He froze for a moment, his jaw tightening, but then kept dabbing her torn lip. You could tell he was trying to get her to meet his eyes, but she looked steadfastly down as his long fingers moved at her mouth. Seemingly satisfied that he had cleaned the blood off, he put his hand down, the other still grasping her chin.
"Please, let me speak," he said.
She sighed. "Draco, I'm tired."
"I know."
"How would you know?"
"I've been reading the papers. I know the work you've been doing."
"Oh, have you now?" She scoffed. "So why are you back? You look awful. Do you need my blood again? Is that why?" His eyes widened.
"No, Granger, of course not,"
he said hastily. "Then why?" she suddenly cried. He was embarrassed at the way her voice sounded. How could she break down like this when it had already been 3 years?
What do you want me to say?" he pleaded.
"I don't want you to say anything. I just want the truth."
"And what truth is that?"
"About why you left, about why you are choosing now to show up at my flat 3 years after you disappeared, without so much as a goodbye." They stared at each other for several seconds.
"We shouldn't have been together," he said.
Hermione's breath caught. She gave a cold laugh and wrestled her chin out of his grip. "Fine. I guess you felt like you needed to tell me that in person. All right, you regret being with me. Now, please leave," she commanded, pleaded. Draco's eyes flashed, and he stepped forward and caught Hermione by the throat, holding it as he pressed her against the door. He could feel her erratic pulse around his palm and lifted her hands to his wrists. She dazedly thought he might kill her for a moment, but he only rested his hand there.
"We shouldn't be together,"
he repeated. Her nostrils flared. "Yes, you already said that."
"But I can't stay away from you anymore,"
he said. His silver eyes were burning as he stared at her.
"No matter what I do, it always comes back to you. I've gone to a new country. Hell, I've moved to a new continent so I could get away from you. Your scent, your hair, even your fucking righteousness follows me everywhere I go."
"Why is that my problem?" He said with a low snarl.
"Do you fucking get it, Granger? You are the sun. You are the one that burns me. You are the antithesis of me as a Malfoy, but also me as a vampire."
Draco looked like he was on the verge of a meltdown. Before she could reply, he continued, rasping out every word as if they had been physically torn from his chest.
"Once I was bitten, I was effectively always going to be tethered to the past. Over the past and what I did and what I could never fix. I was as haunted as the ghosts of the bloody history my name had made. Then you came along, and I should have known. I should have known that it would be you since the first moment I saw you. Large brown eyes and bushy hair, you were new. You were always new to me. Even more so when you showed up at the manor as if none of the darkness could touch you. Then you inserted yourself into my life without even the smallest wave of a scent from me. I don't have to justify my own feelings for you," she declared angrily, feeling her muscles convulse in her rising anger. "Please," he pleaded. "I know I don't deserve your attention after everything, but I need to tell you this."
His broken expression made her falter. When she nodded, he loosened his grip on her. She wished she didn't feel the pull to him and tried to ignore the impulse to move closer, to lose herself in him again.
"I didn't want to drag you any further into my life and let you waste away while I lived on,"
he continued when she looked up at him.
"I didn't want to turn you into a vampire because that would have meant that you'd be bound to me. I was certain that even if you didn't see it, that it was just a temporary interest. You have so many interests that you study, that once you learn everything you need to know, you eventually bore of it and move on to something else. In truth, I was waiting for you to leave."
"Well, I didn't." She breathed and couldn't find her hand as it reached up to touch the red lines under Draco's eyes. It seemed to deflate for a moment, leaning into her before trotting on.
Then I find out that because you are impossible and brilliant you had managed to overturn the wand ban, and I realized that the reason you were almost killed was because of that legislation, because you were doing it for me.
I wasn't killed, she said, glaring at him.
But you almost were,
he said fiercely, his body pressing against hers now, and Hermione really couldn't breathe. She needed him to step away. She needed to tangle her finger in his robes and pull him closer.
You almost died because you fought for me.
Actually, would have hated me, with or without you, Hermione explained in a calmer tone than she felt. She could smell the sandalwood and something else that was distinctly him, and felt the urge to press her face in his robe.
Yes, but it will always remain on my conscience that it was because of me that you went so far.
Draco, she implored, interrupting him, but he continued, raising her hand and nuzzling it against his jaw for a moment, before turning and kissing her palm. The action rocked through Hermione, and she could feel her legs tremble beneath her.
I was selfish, he said. I couldn't endure the idea that you would willingly love me.
Hermione's memories flashed unbiddenly, one by one, as she contemplated the last 3 years. It was hard in the first year, and continued to be in the second. Towards the end of the second year, the company was almost bankrupt, relying on functions and fundraising to keep their finances afloat, which Hermione divided into new projects while also subsiding on the costs of potions and other medicines the creatures and other beings couldn't afford. They were almost out of money until one function, when an anonymous donation saved them. The funds were more than enough to cover an entire year. While she saw right through it, she literally couldn't afford her pride. She begrudgingly accepted the donation and clamped down at the devastating rush of relief that he was okay, and set herself to work harder in the new year. She had something to show for all the grueling work now. Welfare for all magical creatures and other beings had won an unprecedented case last month for the cost of Wolfsbane to be subsided at 90% of its usual cost. The win had subsequently come with a lot more attention. There was a lot of negative reception from pharmaceutical companies who, under the new health laws, were now required to lower their prices for any drugs or herbs relating to the relief of magical creatures and other beings. And positive reception as well, from universities and other scholars who joined Hermione's company, adding both more help and more publicity that made her feel more confident in the future security. She flew to Grimmauld Place to celebrate with Harry and Ginny, who invited Andromeda and Teddy over. She told Teddy they were celebrating something that would have made his daddy happy, and Teddy, usually more reserved, contrary to the turquoise hair he regularly sported, burst into tears, prompting Hermione to shed her own tears as well. She patted his head and hoped that he wouldn't have to suffer the same heartache in this future. "Your dad always said chocolate made someone feel better when they are unwell," Hermione said, picking off a small piece and handing it to Teddy. "I like to think he was right." She looked over at Andromeda as she popped the chocolate in her mouth, and the only kind woman from the Black family gave her a gentle smile before giving her a silent pat on the shoulder as she passed Hermione to the kitchen. She had a feeling the weight of her hand wasn't only for congratulations. She felt a woman's sympathy in the furrowing of her Black family features, not unlike her sisters and her nephew. Hermione excused herself early and went home, hiding under the blankets until it stopped raining. She spent so long feeling angry at first at the way she crumpled slightly at the mention of Malfoy. Hermione told herself that it wasn't love between her and Malfoy. It was two people, lonely and battered in their own ways, using each other for their selfish desires. He wanted her blood, and she wanted to stop feeling alone. The knowledge that it was nothing for him had to have been nothing. It was something irreparable inside her. So she didn't think about it. Until now. "And that's your own fault, isn't it?" she said after several seconds of silence, trying to pull his hand away from her neck to get away from him, but it was a steel force against hers.
I've been trying to get on with my life, but your infuriating face is what I come back to as well, because you didn't give me closure." He stared at her with a sudden fury possessiveness she didn't recognize. "Oh, yes, I heard all about your little dates. Even dated that Ratkinson fella for a good while," he said in a drawl, but she could hear the undercurrents of rage underneath it. Well, good. She tried going on dates, several of them, in an effort to fill the gap he left behind. She even dated a man for several months named Jacob Atkins, who Ginny set her up with and who worked as a healer at St. Mungo's. Jacob was interesting and thoughtful. He and Hermione shared several interesting medical theories, and because he was Muggle-born, they went to the cinema at times without Hermione having to explain what moving pictures were. It was a bit of a gossip, but she could ignore that. Although he had informed her of how Malfoy bought an entire private stock of blood packets to be delivered to him at a private location. She said nothing. Atkinson was a good kisser. He was soft and gentle, and he didn't use teeth. It was just his eyes were too blue, too ocean deep instead of sterling grey. His mouth was too full. Hermione realized that she preferred thinner lips. The planes of his body were larger, and he should have been comforting, but it didn't fit hers the right way when he embraced her. He didn't fit. He was too kind, too understanding. Hermione would snap at him over something pointless because of all her pent-up frustration from, well, she didn't know what, but he only ever responded to mollify her. He never argued, never told her off. She eventually broke up with him due to personality differences. The largest difference being that Hermione was irrevocably in love with Draco Malfoy. The admission of that did not soothe the gnawing at Hermione's heart. She'd read about heartbreak several times before, half the heart feeling like it had been cut from the other. The implosion of a heart that could no longer take the strain it was under. No, what Hermione felt was infinitely worse. It was dark and painful. She felt something invade her heart, containing its structure while it bit and lashed at the delicate organ, punctuating the parts that did not require her survival, forcing her to endure its torture because the walls had been impenetrable to relief. She drowned herself in work, refusing to pine like an idiot and waste her life waiting for someone who did not love her. She did not wait. She got stronger. She wrote down all of the things she wanted to achieve and had always held herself back until it was the right time. She went to floss her teeth one night and found the packet of floss she jokingly told Draco he was going to gift him for Christmas. He'd thrown it into the fire along with the book he gifted her. Atkinson, she corrected, being somewhat vindicative that he was jealous. He got even more satisfied when his eyes flashed. "Hermione," he said in warning, and she shivered at the way he used her name. Not even 20 minutes with him in a flat, and he had already reduced her to a trembling mess. 3 years really didn't grow her as a person, apparently. It did enough, however, to give her confidence to say what she said next. "I love you, Draco," she said, looking him clearly in the eyes. His eyes widened. He must have thought she was going to continue arguing with him and looked lost as what to say next. "I..." He tried, but she cut him off. "You deprived me of saying that to you 3 years ago. I get to say it now before I tell you to leave." "Granger, I want you to leave," she said, forcing a blank look on her face. "What?" he asked, confusion filtering across his face. "You act like it was only hard for you. That it was only you that had to endure these past 3 years alone." Hermione gasped as she tried to breathe, losing some of her carefully woven control. "You come back now with full knowledge of where I live and what I've been doing with my life, but you did not grant me the same right." "I have no idea what you have been doing while you've been gone." "I did nothing. I don't want to know," she said, hearing an unfamiliar detachment in her voice. He couldn't bear raising it for fear of crying. He froze. God damn it all. She felt her tears sliding down her face, meeting his hand as it trailed across her chin. "I don't want to know," she repeated more quietly.
I want you to leave.
Granger?
She looked up at him, not even bothering to mask the sheer hurt she felt when she stared up at him. His pale skin, his pointy nose, his sharp jaw, that had a little bit of blonde hair if you looked close enough, and his eyes. Those silver, ethereal eyes burned her as she stared with an expression of devastating want. But she couldn't. A cry sounded in the air, and she realized it was coming from her. Draco's eyes widened, and he stepped closer to her, letting go of Hermione's neck to pull her into his arms. She pushed against him, but he wouldn't let go.
Draco, let go of me. I can't, he said. I said, let go.
She pushed against him even more, slapping his chest to try and get away from him. She needed to get away from him.
Don't you get it? I fucking can't, he said.
Pulled her back, but held onto her arms tightly. The back of her mind registers his painful grip, but she was pinned in place by the strength of emotion in his eyes as he looked at her with pleading eyes.
I need you, Hermione,
he said, his voice breaking over the words.
Draco, I'm selfish, and I've tried being noble the last 3 years because I knew the only way we could be together is if I turned you,
he said, and Hermione gawked at him, trying to process the magnitude of what he was telling her. Hermione's mouth thinned as she tried not to scream at him.
You said... I know, I said I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do that to you. You didn't, and you still don't deserve to be tied down to someone like me.
He tucked an escaped curl behind her ear, staring at it for a moment before putting his hand down.
You will always deserve better. But do you know what I realized?
Hermione shook her head. He gave her a sad smile.
That you are the smartest person I know. You will come over all of the facts and reasons when you're making a decision, weigh all of the pro and cons so stubbornly and ruthlessly until you reach a decision that favors what you want.
Hermione felt naked in his assessment, but let him go on.
So, while I don't want to turn you into a vampire because I think your life is better off without me, I was wrong to think that the decision only rested with me.
It's not that simple, she said. You hurt me. You left me alone, she thought privately.
I know I did, and I'm so sorry. But I can't turn back time. I don't deserve you, Hermione, but I want.
Hermione felt herself falling. What do you want? She asked, her breath becoming ragged at his proximity, his voice, his scent, his touch, his stupid fucking eyes. They were making her falter, and she couldn't.
I want you forever long. You will have me.
His voice was the clearest it had been, so sincere that it toppled her ability to think, to breathe.
If you want me to turn you, I will. I promise I will. But if you want me to leave, I won't bother you again.
Hermione's eyes widened. She'd never seen him so emotional before. He looked pained as he stared at her. When she seemed to falter and loosen in his hold, he leaned down and tried to kiss her. She turned her head away before he reached her mouth. Froze, and she could feel his soft, warm breath against her cheek. She looked up at him again, hoping her mouth would not betray her, as it had so many times before. Please leave, Draco, he said softly, because if she said it any louder, he would hear the desperate lie in her voice. But he had to. He needed to go. Draco's face wilted as he stared at her, and she felt her heart break as the way his face morphed from pleading to devastated to a horrific blank mask. The tense and determined curve of his jaw slackened, the strain of his mouth loosed. His shining silver eyes dulled now as he stared at her, as if he couldn't see her any longer. He dropped his arms.
I'm sorry to have wasted your time,
he said quietly. He walked around her, and she could feel him hesitate for one moment before he opened and closed the door. The wall built itself between them again. Not a neatly structured one with clean-shaven bricks lining on top of one another in neat rows, but smashed uneven stone covered with dust, broken by the very love that tore them apart. The return of Draco Malfoy was worth a profit headline, apparently. She steadfastly refused to read anything about him, although that didn't much help considering everyone else did. She would walk to her office and hear people talking about his return to Malfoy Manor and how the prolific vampire was spotted around Wizarding Society more than he had been when he was first turned. Luna had mentioned at a girls' lunch with Ginny that Draco had paid a large grant to the research facility she worked at to study creatures and potential cures, even contributing his own research. Apparently, he thought he could buy forgiveness with money, Hermione thought bitterly. But then she wondered. "Luna," she began, "what kind of research was it?" "Oh," Luna replied airily, her wide blue eyes more attentive to the croissant she was eating at the breakfast cafe they were at. "Magical cures? Creature engineering?" Hermione furrowed her brows. "Engineering?" She echoed. "I think Draco was inquiring about curing his vampirism," he explained, looking at Hermione with a probing expression. Hermione, on the other hand, couldn't swallow. "A cure?" she gulped tightly. "Is that even possible?" Luna looked to the side. Hermione didn't know where, seemingly distracted for a moment, before sliding her eyes back to Hermione. "For now, no. But magical science is making great strides." Hermione nodded numbly. Could Draco actually be thinking of trying to cure his vampirism? She shook her head. It wasn't any of her business, after all. A few weeks passed where Hermione started seeing more and more of him whenever she was in Diagon Alley or visited Neville at the hospital. Neville told her how he started working with the Society of Vampires to obtain more sustainable blood packets. She nodded but didn't say anything. Saw Malfoy walk out of her room just as she passed the reception desk to the floor, but rushed into the green flames without looking to see if he saw her. Her heart was pounding as she arrived in a dust-mote hotel. It was so off-kilter that she had mispronounced the destination. After receiving a lecture from the hotel owner about not using the flue unless she was going to book a room, Hermione called her correct location, exhausted and unnerved. It was a Friday when she saw him at Flourish and Blott's, browsing potions books. Hermione and Ginny had been window shopping when she dragged Ginny into the bookstore for a new charms book she saw on display. She grabbed the book and turned an aisle when she saw him, looking intently at the book. She watched him for a moment. Lips were pursed as he stared down at the book, and her own lips quirked up, and she remembered that this was the face he made when he disagreed with something. Trying to overcome an overbearing need to ask him what the book said that warranted such an unfavorable look, Hermione was about to turn away when Ginny, the friend who should not live, called her name. Draco jolted and looked up at her, grey eyes wide, and Hermione all but ran out of the shop, leaving Ginny behind to catch up to her. Ginny found Hermione crying, hyperventilating, both, and took her in her arms. That night, with a bottle of wine shared between them, Hermione told Ginny all about how she fell in love with the one person she shouldn't have. How she saw the way his face fell in the moments he forgot he no longer had a wand, how he loved Muggle philosophy and science and could talk about it as much as she did. How his eyes didn't glaze over when she spoke. How he saw her, really saw her, and how it made her feel less alone. How alone she felt then when he left. How her heart stuttered each time she thought of him. How close it came to breaking when she saw him again. How she felt an inexplicable, ravished need for him that defied logic. How she hated it. This illogical thing that scratched to the very core of her. Her friend could do no more than pat her on the back and let Hermione cry. "It's not supposed to be logical, Hermione," Ginny said, soothing Hermione's wild curls with a gentle hand. "This isn't something that can be resolved by you reading about it." "Is it supposed to hurt this much, though?" Hermione asked, hiccuping from the wine and wiping her tears with her sleeve. Ginny placed her head on Hermione's shoulder. "I think so, yes. It can't be easy deciding to be with Malfoy, I'm sure. Vampirism notwithstanding, but it doesn't mean that it isn't worth it." "How am I supposed to decide that?" "Ask yourself if he's worth it, then move from there." To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of 8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotion. If you would like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.